In this first module, we'll talk about the role of events, delegates, and event handlers in the .NET framework. Now, if you've worked with .NET before, then you may be saying, well, hey Dan, I've already done this. I've drug on a button, for instance, and double-clicked it in Visual Studio, and got an event handler, and it was really easy. Well, the goal of this particular module is to actually go into a little more detail on how all three of these relate to each other, and you're going to see, for instance, that delegates are a super important part of the picture that when you just double click on a button, you really never see that. That's something that is normally generated behind the scenes. So we'll talk about the role that all three of these have and how it all fits together and show the big picture. So what I'm going to start off with is the role of events and what events are used for in the framework. From there, we'll go into the role of delegates. And as I mentioned, delegates are a super critical part of the .NET framework. And really, without delegates, we wouldn't have events. And then we'll wrap up with the role of event handlers. Now, a good way to think about this is the old tin can with a string analogy. If you ever did this as a kid, it was kind of a fun way to talk, and it seemed really cool when you were little. Well, this actually is a really good analogy for events, delegates, and event handlers, and also event args. Over here on the left, we have the little girl here who's talking in, and then you'll notice possibly her dad over here is listening. And so we could say that the little girl is the event raiser, and the dad is the event handler. Now, there's got to be some glue, though, or a pipeline between the event raiser and the event handler, and we call that the delegate. The delegate is really what makes everything possible when it comes to raising events and handling events, because if you think about it, if I raise an event that something happens, such as the kid talking into the tin can here, then how does that actually make it over to the dad? Well, assuming that they couldn't just hear him normally, of course, since they could, it travels across that string and it makes it a little more amplified. Well, that's the role of a delegate. And so we'll talk more about that as we jump in here. Now, another important piece is the event args, because when the child talks in, really we need that data to get over to the event handler. And in the .NET world, of course, we call that event args. And event args are the actual data. It could be one or more properties. For instance, with a simple button click, there's not a lot to it. The event args is just going to be empty and you don't use it much. But with things like a mouse click, then things get a little more interesting, because we might want to know the X and Y coordinate, what button did they click, and those types of things. So this is really where we start, though, when it comes to events, delegates, event handlers, and event args. If you understand the general concept of how the child is talking and raising an event over to the event handler, and how the string is really like the delegate, then you understand the general concept of all these different things we'll be talking about here. So now that we've talked about that, let's take a closer look at how we can work with events.